CIA Director Jonathan Cole is pulled over and held at gunpoint by a prejudiced officer without cause. Remaining calm, he uses his authority to expose a misconduct, leading to the officer's suspension. As the incident gains national attention, Jonathan pushes for accountability and systemic police reform, ensuring his experience becomes a turning point for justice and change. If you like this content, don't forget to like, share this story with your friends and family, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. It was a quiet evening in suburban Virginia, and Director Jonathan Cole of the CIA was driving back from a classified briefing at Langley. The air was crisp, the streets were dimly lit, and the hum of his sleek black sedan blended with the distant sounds of nocturnal wildlife. Jonathan, a man of extraordinary poise and intellect, had always felt that his unassuming demeanor helped him blend in, a trait that served him well in a career that thrived on discretion. The road ahead stretched dark and desolate. Jonathan glanced at the dashboard clock, 11:23 p.m. As he approached the stop sign, a pair of glaring headlights appeared in his rear-view mirror. A police cruiser. He paid it no mind and signaled to turn left. As soon as he made the turn, the unmistakable whirl of sirens and flashing red and blue lights shattered the night's tranquility. Jonathan's brow furrowed. He hadn't been speeding or breaking any laws. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road, his calm demeanor hiding the frustration brewing beneath the surface. He rolled down his window and placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained from years of knowing the precarious balance between compliance and self-preservation. A burly white officer approached the car with a flashlight. The beam scanned the interior, lingering on Jonathan's face. Without greeting or explanation, the officer barked, "Step out of the vehicle." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting the officer's steely gaze. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice measured and devoid of fear. "I said, step out of the car. Now?" the officer repeated, his hand hovering near his holster. Jonathan slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, the cold night air brushing against his tailored suit. His 6-foot frame stood tall and commanding, yet he made no sudden movements. "Hands on the hood," the officer shouted. Jonathan complied, his mind calculating. This wasn't about a traffic violation. The officer hadn't even asked for his license or registration. It was about something deeper, something uglier. The officer drew his weapon and aimed it squarely at Jonathan back. "What's a guy like you do in a car like this, dressed like that?" he sneered. Jonathan didn't flinch. His instinct screamed at him to de-escalate, but his training told him to stay composed. "I wasn't aware that dressing professionally was a crime," he replied, his tone razor-sharp. "Are you going to tell me why you pulled me over?" The officer smirked. "We'll see about that. Let's take a look in your trunk." Jonathan arched a brow. "You're not even going to ask for my ID." "I said open the trunk." The officer snapped, ignoring the question. Jonathan's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Very well," he said, moving to the trunk with deliberate slowness. As he opened it, the officer leaned in with his flashlight, eager to find something incriminating. What he saw made his face pale. The interior was meticulously organized, a black briefcase with an embossed seal, an official government badge perched on top, and a dossier stamped with top secret. The weight of realization dawned on the officer as his flashlight flickered across the unmistakable emblem of the Central Intelligence Agency. "What's wrong, officer?" Jonathan asked, his voice cool and laced with quiet authority. "Find something you weren't expecting." The officer stumbled back a step, the barrel of his gun trembling slightly as his flashlight beam remained fixed on the contents of the trunk. His jaw tightened, but his pride and prejudice outweighed the clear evidence in front of him. He wasn't about to let this man, this black man, intimidate him, regardless of the insignia staring back at him. "Step away from the trunk," he barked, his voice shaking slightly now. "You expect me to believe you're CA? That's a good one. What are you, some kind of con man?" Jonathan's expression didn't falter, though he could feel the tension. Escalating like a ticking time bomb, he calmly shut the trunk, the quiet click echoing unervingly in the empty street. Turning to face the officer, his sharp brown eyes locked onto the man's pale blue ones. "Con man," Jonathan repeated, his tone laced with quiet incredulity. Do you often accuse people of espionage without cause? Or is this your idea of enforcing the law? The officer bristled, taking a step forward, his hand still on the gun's grip. You don't get to question me, he snarled, and I don't need a reason to detain you. You look suspicious. Suspicious? Jonathan's voice was a mirror of calm, though his words were cutting. Driving through my own neighborhood in a suit and tie makes me suspicious. Or does my skin color give you license to ignore protocol? The officer's face hardened. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone so composed. Watch your mouth. He growled, though the threat sounded hollow. Jonathan took a single step closer, his presence commanding. He spoke slowly, deliberately. You're in over your head, officer. What's your name? He glanced at the badge clipped to the man's uniform. Ryan, Officer Ryan. The man's cheeks reddened, his grip tightening on his gun. I don't need to explain myself to you. Jonathan raised a single brow. Actually, you do. You failed to identify any probable cause for this stop. You've escalated to pointing a weapon without provocation, and you've ignored every standard procedure in the book. I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next move. Ryan took another step back, feeling the weight of the situation, though his pride refused to let him back down entirely. You think you're smarter than me, don't you? Flashing some fake badge, spouting legal nonsense. Fake badge, Jonathan interrupted, his tone as sharp as a blade. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his credentials. He held them up, the gold lettering glinting under the streetlights. This isn't fake. My name is Jonathan Cole, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I suggest you take a good, long look at that, Officer Ryan, and think about the implications of your actions tonight. Ryan froze. His eyes darted to the badge, the seal, the photo ID. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint chirp of crickets in the distance. I'd like you to call your supervisor, Jonathan continued, his voice firm but eerily calm. Right now. Ryan's hand wavered over his radio. I don't need to. Oh. But you do, Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Because if you don't, I'll make sure your department gets a phone call they won't forget. And trust me, Ryan, you don't want to make sure your department gets a phone call they won't forget. And trust me, Ryan, you don't want to find out what happens when the CA starts asking questions. Ryan hesitated, his mind racing. His instinct was to double down, but the cold certainty in Jonathan's eyes told him he was treading on thin ice. With shaking fingers, he reached for his radio and reluctantly called in for backup. Jonathan folded his arms and leaned casually against the hood of his car, watching the officer squirm. Inside, his adrenaline was spiking, but his years of training had taught him to channel it into focus. He didn't need to raise his voice or lash out. His presence alone was enough to turn the tables. As the distant wail of another patrol car approached, Ryan looked like a cornered animal, his confidence unraveling. Jonathan, on the other hand, stood tall and steady, the calm in the storm. The faint whine of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense silence. Jonathan remained unmoving, his arms folded as Officer Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside his squad car. The man's earlier bravado seemed to shrink with every passing second. Though his hand lingered near his holstered gun, a last shred of control, he clung to desperately. Jonathan, however, didn't spare him a second glance. His focus was on the approaching patrol car. The second squad car pulled up to the scene, its flashing lights illuminating the quiet street in harsh, rotating hues of red and blue. Two officers stepped out, one a younger man with sandy hair and a nervous expression, the other a seasoned sergeant whose presence immediately commanded respect. Sergeant Daniel was a black man in his late 50s, his graying beard framing a face that spoke of decades of experience and little patience for nonsense. "What's going on here, Ryan?" Sergeant Daniel asked, his voice even but firm as he approached. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, lingering on Jonathan, who stood with an air of calm authority. Ryan snapped to attention, though his tension was palpable. "Sir, I pulled this man over for suspicious behavior. He's claiming to be CIA, but—" Jonathan cut him off, his voice measured but unyielding. Not claiming, Sergeant. I am the director of the CIA, Jonathan Cole. He stepped forward and extended the credentials, the polished badge and identification glinting under the flashing lights. Sergeant Daniel took the badge, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. His expression remained unreadable as he turned to Jonathan. Director Cole, he said carefully, handing back the badge, I'm going to have to apologize on behalf of my department if there has been any misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Sergeant, Jonathan replied, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. Your officer pulled me over without cause, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and held me at gunpoint while refusing to explain himself. Daniel's eyes flicked to Ryan, who looked like he wanted to melt into the asphalt. The sergeant's voice grew cold. Is this true, Ryan? Ryan stammered, his earlier confidence now entirely eroded. I thought he looked suspicious, sir. Driving an expensive car, late at night. Suspicious, Jonathan interjected, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of restrained fury. I suppose being black in a suit and tie, driving a government-issued vehicle, is all it takes to raise suspicion in your eyes. Sergeant Daniel's jaw tightened, his gaze snapping back to Ryan. Did you even ask for his identification before drawing your weapon? No, sir, Ryan muttered, his face flushing red. And why exactly did you feel the need to escalate this to a drawn weapon? Daniel pressed, his tone growing sharper. Ryan floundered. He wasn't complying fast enough, and I. Jonathan let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You didn't give me a chance to comply. Officer Ryan, you were too busy assuming I was a criminal. Daniel held up a hand, silencing Ryan's incoherent defense. Turning to Jonathan, he inclined his head. Director Cole, I assure you, this will be dealt with swiftly. If you like, we can file a formal report right now. Jonathan's expression softened, but only slightly. I think that's a good start, Sergeant, but I'd like to stay and ensure it's handled properly. I've seen far too many cases of these incidents being swept under the rug. Daniel nodded, his respect for Jonathan evident. Understood, sir. As Sergeant Daniel called in additional units and began the process of documenting the incident, Jonathan took a step closer to Ryan, his towering presence making the officer shrink even further. You made a grave mistake tonight, Officer Ryan, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. And the consequences of your actions will be a lesson you won't soon forget. Ryan couldn't meet his gaze, his earlier arrogance now completely replaced by shame and fear. Jonathan's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with the weight of what was to come. The street now buzzed with activity as 2 more squad cars arrived, their flashing lights casting sharp, jagged shadows on the pavement. Uniformed officers stepped out, some exchanging puzzled glances as they assessed the scene. Word had spread quickly over the radio, an incident involving a CA official. The gravity of the situation was palpable. Jonathan remained composed, his arms crossed as he stood by the hood of his car. The cold air bit at his skin, but his gaze never wavered. Every movement, every word from the officers now arriving, was being etched into his memory. This wasn't just about him. This was about accountability, about ensuring this incident wouldn't disappear under bureaucratic red tape. Sergeant Daniel directed the newly arrived officers with swift efficiency. Start taking statements, he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. I want everything logged, dash cam footage, body cam footage, timestamps. I don't care if this takes all night. We're doing this by the book. As officers moved to follow his orders, Daniel turned back to Ryan, whose face was now a mix of humiliation and dread. Hand over your weapon, the sergeant demanded. Ryan's head snapped up, his lips parting as if to protest. But one look at Daniel's unyielding expression silenced him. Reluctantly, he unholstered his gun and handed it over, his hands shaking slightly. Badge 2, Daniel added, holding out his other hand. But, sir, Ryan began, his voice faltering. Badge 2, Daniel added, holding out his other hand. But, sir, Ryan began, his voice faltering. Badge now, Daniel said, his tone brooking no argument. You crossed every line tonight, Ryan, and until this investigation is complete, you're suspended. Consider yourself lucky we're not cuffing you on the spot. Ryan hesitated, his jaw tightening as though clinging to some shred of defiance. But eventually he unclipped his badge and slapped it into Daniel's palm. His movements were jerky, his anger bubbling beneath the surface, though it was clear he had no ground to stand on. Meanwhile, Jonathan stood silently, observing every detail with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading people. He watched as officers reviewed Ryan's bodicam footage, their expressions shifting from neutral professionalism to barely concealed disgust. It was clear the footage corroborated everything Jonathan had said, and more. One officer, a young woman with a steady demeanor, approached Sergeant Daniel. "Sir, the footage shows Officer Ryan escalating the situation from the start. No request for ID, no explanation for stop. He drew his weapon before Mr. Cole even stepped out of the car." Daniel's expression darkened. "Copy the footage. Secure it as evidence. Make sure it doesn't go missing." "Yes, sir," she replied, moving to carry out the order. Ryan, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, seemed to sense the noose tightening around him. "This is a setup," he blurted, his voice rising. "He's using his position to twist this whole thing around. I thought he might be armed." The excuse hung in the air, hollow and desperate. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Armed? You didn't even give me a chance to reach for my wallet, let alone anything else. This wasn't about a weapon, Ryan. This was about me. You saw a black man driving a car you didn't think he deserved, and you acted on your prejudice." Ryan's face reddened, but he had no retort. The weight of his actions was now undeniable, laid bare in front of his colleagues. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan turned to Sergeant Daniel. "What happens next, Sergeant?" Daniel straightened, his voice steady but resolute. "Next, we file a full report. Ryan will be formally investigated for misconduct, likely stripped of his badge permanently. This isn't going away." "And what about accountability beyond your department?" Jonathan asked, his tone calm but insistent. "What safeguards are in place to ensure this doesn't happen again? To someone else who doesn't have the title or resources I do?" Lewis hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll ensure this incident reaches the right channels. You have my word." Jonathan gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, though his face remained unreadable. "I'll be following up personally," he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise. As Daniel began delegating further tasks to his officers, Ryan stood frozen, his career unraveling before his eyes. For the first time that night, Jonathan allowed himself a faint, grim smile, not one of triumph, but quiet satisfaction. This was justice, or at least the beginning of it. Inside the small, fluorescent-lit precinct, the air was thick with tension. Jonathan sat at the head of the table in the conference room, his back straight, his presence commanding without effort. Opposite him sat Sergeant Daniel, an internal affairs officer hastily summoned to oversee the incident, and Officer Ryan, whose pale, beaded face told the story of a man teetering on the edge of ruin. On the table between them lay the evidence, Ryan bodycam footage, the official report being drafted, and Jonathan's impeccable credentials. The details were stacking up against Ryan faster than he could process them. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his eyes darting to the clock, as though hoping time might somehow reverse itself. Jonathan, however, remained calm and collected, though his sharp gaze betrayed the controlled fire within him. This was not his first encounter with systemic prejudice, nor was it likely to be his last. But he knew this moment was bigger than him. It was an opportunity to make sure Ryan and others like him were held accountable in ways they rarely were. The internal affairs officer, a stern-faced woman named Inspector Rachel, broke the silence first. "Let's go through this step by step, Officer Ryan," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "You stated you pulled Director Cole over because he appeared suspicious. Can you clarify what about his behavior or vehicle was suspicious?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his behavior or vehicle was suspicious. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was late at night," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "And he was driving a high-end car in a neighborhood where we've had reports of car thefts." Rachel arched an unimpressed brow. "So his only crime was driving an expensive car?" Ryan floundered. "No, I mean he wasn't cooperating." Jonathan finally spoke, his voice measured but cutting. "You didn't give me a chance to cooperate. Officer Ryan, you demanded I step out of the vehicle without stating your reason for the stop. And when I complied, you escalated to drawing your weapon. Ryan's face turned red, but Jonathan pressed on, his tone unwavering. You never asked for my ID, registration, or proof of ownership. You ignored every protocol designed to ensure mutual safety. And when I opened my trunk, you saw the truth staring you in the face, but your prejudice wouldn't let you back down. Instead, you doubled down. Rachel nodded, her pen scratching against her notepad as she recorded every word. The body cam footage corroborates Director Cole's account. She said, turning to Ryan, you escalated the situation without cause. Your actions were reckless, unprofessional, and frankly, dangerous. Ryan opened his mouth to protest, but was silenced by Jonathan's sharp gaze. Let me ask you something. Officer Ryan, Jonathan said, leaning forward slightly. If I weren't wearing this suit, if I didn't have that CA badge, how you think this night would have ended? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Ryan looked away, his jaw tightening, but he couldn't answer. The truth was painfully clear. Sergeant Daniel, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his voice low and steady. Director Cole, I think we all know the answer to that question, and it's a question we've all had to face too many times. Jonathan turned to Daniel, his expression softening slightly. Then let's not treat this as just another internal incident swept under the rug. You have an opportunity here to make a statement, not just to Officer Ryan, but to your entire department. Rachel nodded in agreement. Director Cole is right. This isn't an isolated event, and we all know it. Officer Ryan's actions tonight were a symptom of a larger problem. If we don't address it head on, we're complicit. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Ryan slumped further into his chair, realizing that any defense he might muster would crumble under the mountain of evidence and the glaring reality of his actions. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but resolute. I don't want a slap on the wrist or a temporary suspension. I want accountability, formal charges for misconduct, mandatory anti-bias training for the entire department. And I want it all on record. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else has to through what I did tonight. Rachel glanced at Daniel, who gave a solemn nod. It'll be done, she said firmly. Officer Ryan will face disciplinary action and be removed from duty pending investigation. And I'll personally see to it that the training Director Holloway mentioned is implemented across the board. Ryan's head shot up, his face pale. This is my career you're talking about. He blurted desperation seeping into his voice. I made a mistake, but you're going to ruin my life over it. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. You held a gun to my back without cause. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences, Officer Ryan. Maybe this will teach you to think twice the next time you're tempted to let prejudice dictate your actions. The finality in his tone silenced Ryan for good. Rachel stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I'll have the report finalized and submitted to the appropriate authorities by morning, she said. Director Cole, thank you for your cooperation. Jonathan rose to his feet, his composure unshaken. I'll be watching, he said simply, his words carrying both a promise and a warning. The following morning, the incident was the talk of the precinct. Word had spread quickly, not just about Ryan's misconduct, but about who exactly he had targeted, a CA director. The gravity of the situation was undeniable, and the fallout was swift. Officer Ryan sat in a small holding room, his badge and gun already confiscated, waiting for what felt like his execution. His hands trembled as he flipped to the misconduct paperwork he'd been handed earlier. Words like dereliction of duty, racial profiling, and reckless endangerment leapt out at him, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. His face was pale, and the defiance that had carried him through the night before was gone. He knew the evidence was airtight, and there was no way out. Meanwhile, Jonathan Cole was at the CA headquarters, sitting in a sleek office overlooking the sprawling Langley campus. His mind wasn't on his usual high-stakes work involving national security or intelligence briefings. Instead, he was on the phone, ensuring that Ryan actions wouldn't be quietly buried like so many similar incidents. He spoke calmly but firmly with state officials, ensuring that Ryan would face criminal charges for misuse of force and racial bias. Governor William, this can't just be another case of an officer suspended with pay, Jonathan said into phone. That's not accountability. If law enforcement wants public trust, they need to show that officers like Ryan don't represent the values they claim to uphold. On the other end of the line, the Governor William, a middle-aged white man who had long avoided taking strong stances on police misconduct, cleared his throat awkwardly. Director Cole, you have my word this matter will be handled appropriately. We'll make sure the investigation is thorough. Thorough is good, Jonathan replied, his voice like ice, but decisive is better. When Jonathan ended the call, he took a moment to exhale deeply. Despite his calm exterior, the events of the previous night had left a mark. He had faced prejudice many times in his life, even in his climb to the top of the intelligence community. But last night had been different. Being held at gunpoint by someone sworn to protect and serve was a stark reminder of how deeply racism ran in the system. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Sergeant Daniel stood before his officers during a mandatory debriefing. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. Many of you think that what he did is defensible. You're in the wrong line of work. The room was silent, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Some officers avoided eye contact, their discomfort evident. Others nodded solemnly, recognizing the need for change. Daniel continued, Director Cole's experience should never have happened, and while Ryan will face the consequences of his actions, this department has a responsibility to do better. We're instituting immediate anti-bias training, and I expect every single one of you to treat it as seriously as your firearms training. Lives depend on it. As the day unfolded, Ryan's suspension became public knowledge, and the media caught wind of the story. The headline ran on local news channels by midday. Officers suspended for holding CA director at gunpoint without cause. Reporters swarmed the precinct, looking for a statement, but the department maintained its silence for the moment. Meanwhile, discussions about racial bias in policing began to dominate the airwaves, with Jonathan's name at the center of it all. Back at home that evening, Jonathan sat in his quiet living room, sipping a cup of tea as the news anchor recounted the incident. He watched with measured expression, his mind racing not with anger but with resolve. He knew that Ryan's suspension and pending charges were just the beginning. Real change required more than one officer losing his badge. It required systemic reform, and Jonathan was prepared to take the beginning. Real change required more than one officer losing his badge. It required systemic reform, and Jonathan was prepared to leverage his position to push for exactly that. Meanwhile, Stephen sat in his apartment, the weight of his actions finally settling in. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages, some from colleagues expressing shock, others from friends who weren't sure whether to support him or distance themselves. The news played softly in the background, but Ryan didn't need to hear it. He already knew what they were saying. His career was over, his name tarnished, and there was no one to blame but himself. For the first time in years, Ryan felt something unfamiliar, regret. It wasn't just regret for losing his badge or his standing. It was a growing awareness that he had acted out of sheer prejudice. He thought back to the look in Jonathan's eyes the night before, not anger, but disappointment. It stung in a way he couldn't explain. The fallout from the incident continued to ripple outward, sending shockwaves through both the precinct and the community. Jonathan Cole had unintentionally become a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change, and while he hadn't sought the spotlight, he knew this moment was too important to ignore. As days passed, conversations surrounding the encounter grew louder. It was no longer just about what had happened to Jonathan. It was about what it represented. The issue of racial profiling, long swept under the rug, was now at the forefront of public discourse, and Jonathan was determined to ensure it stayed there. 3 days after the incident, Jonathan stood at a podium in the state capitol, addressing a crowd that had gathered to hear his response. Cameras clicked furiously, reporters poised to capture every word. Jonathan took a deep breath, his commanding presence quieting the murmurs in the room. Last week, I experienced something that far too many people in this country face every day. He began, his voice steady. I was judged not by my character or my actions, but by the color of my skin. This wasn't about a broken taillight or a traffic violation. This was about bias, a bias so deeply ingrained that it allows some to see threat where there is none. The room fell silent as Jonathan paused, letting his words settle. I am not here today as a victim. He continued, I am here as someone who has been given an opportunity to push for change. This isn't just about one officer or one department. It's about a system that has allowed incidents like this to happen for decades. That's why I am calling for comprehensive reforms, mandatory anti-dash, bias training for law enforcement, independent oversight committees to ensure transparency, and policies that hold officers accountable for their actions. The applause was immediate and thunderous, but Jonathan remained somber, his tone unwavering. This isn't a moment to celebrate. It's a moment to act. If we want to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, we must confront these issues head-on. While Jonathan focused on systemic change, Officer Ryan was beginning to face the consequences of his actions. Suspended from duty and under investigation, Ryan found himself at the center of public scrutiny. News outlets replayed the Bodicum footage relentlessly, dissecting his every move, his every word. Ryan's name had become synonymous with racial profiling, and the weight of it was crushing. Sitting in his small apartment, his badge and gun confiscated, Ryan replayed the night's events in his mind. For the first time, he truly saw himself as Jonathan had seen him, not as an officer upholding the law, but as a man who was a man of his mind. For the first time, he truly saw himself as Jonathan had seen him, not as an officer upholding the law, but as a man blinded by prejudice. The investigation moved quickly. The evidence was damning, and within days, Ryan was formally charged with misconduct and reckless endangerment. He sat in a small interrogation room as internal affairs officers laid out the charges. His attempt to defend himself sounded hollow even to his own ears. I was just doing my job, he muttered weakly, though he knew it wasn't true. He wasn't just doing his job. He had abused his power, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, Jonathan continued his efforts behind the scenes. He spoke with state officials, police chiefs, and community leaders, ensuring that the momentum for reform didn't falter. He knew the system wouldn't change overnight, but he also knew that progress started with moments like this, moments where accountability was demanded and action was taken. One evening, Jonathan received a call from Sergeant Daniel. The older officer's voice carried a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Director Cole, Daniel said, I wanted to let you know we've started implementing the changes you suggested. Anti-bias training is now mandatory, and we've formed an oversight committee with civilian representatives. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, allowing a small, satisfied smile to touch his lips. That's good to hear, Sergeant. It's a step in the right direction. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Jonathan's encounter and his subsequent push for reform became a national conversation. Ryan's trial began, and Jonathan took the stand as a key witness. He recounted the events of that night with the same calm and clarity that had disarmed Ryan in the first place. The courtroom was silent as he described the moment the gun was pointed at his back, the prejudice he saw in Ryan's eyes, and the resolve he felt not to let it break him. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before finding Ryan guilty of misconduct and reckless endangerment. His sentence was a mix of probation, community service, and mandatory anti-bias training, far from the harsher punishments many had hoped for, but enough to ensure he would never wear a badge again. For Ryan, the verdict was a bitter pill to swallow. His career was over, and his name was tarnished. But as he walked out of the courtroom that day, he couldn't shake the image of Jonathan standing tall on the witness stand, speaking with dignity and strength. It was a moment that would haunt him, but perhaps also one that would teach him. For Jonathan, the verdict was just one part of a much larger battle. He knew the road to justice was long, but he also knew that this was a start. The night of the incident had been a moment of injustice, but the days that followed had turned it into something bigger, a catalyst for change. The month that followed the incident were a blur of progress, reflection, and quiet victories. Jonathan Cole found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't intended to lead, but had embraced nonetheless. His voice became a rallying cry for accountability and reform, and his actions served as a reminder that dignity and resilience could dismantle even the most ingrained systems of prejudice. Sitting in his office one evening, Jonathan stared out the window at the fading light of the city below. The world outside seemed calm, but he knew that change was often quiet first. It started in conversations behind closed doors, in training sessions where officers questioned their own biases, and in the policies now being written to ensure a future where people wouldn't have to fear those sworn to protect them. He sipped his tea, reflecting on the night it had all started. The image of Officer Ryan trembling hands as he aimed his weapon at Jonathan back was seared into his memory, not as a source of anger, but as a symbol of the deep flaws in the system. Ryan's actions weren't an anomaly. They were a product of a culture that had allowed bias to go unchecked for far too long. And yet, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The reforms being implemented, the mandatory anti-bias training, the oversight committees were steps forward. Small steps, but meaningful ones. Jonathan thought about Ryan, whose name had become a cautionary tale. Reports had reached Jonathan that Ryan, now stripped of his badge, was serving his community service by volunteering at local shelters and attending counseling sessions as part of the sentence. While Jonathan had no illusions that Ryan's transformation would be immediate or even complete, he hoped the man would begin to understand the weight of his actions and the damage they had caused. It wasn't forgiveness Jonathan sought, but growth from Ryan and from the system as a whole. As Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the faint chime of his phone broke the silence. It was Sergeant Daniel. "Director Cole," Daniel began, his voice tinged with respect. "I wanted to give you an update. The first round of anti-bias training wrapped up today. We've had officers, some of our best, admit they've never truly reflected on their own biases until now. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Jonathan allowed himself a rare smile. "It's more than a start, Sergeant. It's progress. Keep at it." "We will," Daniel replied. "And sir, I want to thank you. You've set an example not just for us, but for every department watching. I don't think we would have had the courage to make these changes without your push." After the call ended, Jonathan sat in silence, the weight of the journey settling over him. He knew there would still be setbacks, moments of frustration, and battles yet to be fought. But he also knew that one night, one encounter, had sparked something that couldn't be extinguished. He thought of the countless people who would never know his name, whose lives might be made a little safer because of the changes being set in motion. That was enough. It had to be. Jonathan had spent a lifetime working in the shadows, protecting his country from unseen threats. Now he was shining a light on one of its most visible flaws. As he prepared to leave his office that night, Jonathan paused at the door, looking back at the sleek desk and the reports scattered across it. He had taken on some of the world's most dangerous adversaries, but this fight felt different. It was personal, and it wasn't over. Stepping out into the night, Jonathan inhaled the cool air and walked to his car, his mind already turning to the next steps. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. Change, he knew, was a journey, not a destination. And in his own quiet way, Jonathan Cole was determined to keep walking. To keep walking. The end.